right, so we'll call the Committee of the Whole to order. First, I'll move to approve the minutes of the January 17th Committee of the Whole.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. That
Aye.
motion passes. So next up, we have an update from the Planning Department regarding the proposed downtown development, and I believe have some of this we're going to do out here. Dr. Leininger, are we going to you?
Either way.
Yeah, I can kick it off and turn it over to Director Leininger. Thank you. Good evening, members of council. We are here today to provide an update to City Council and the public on some substantial changes to the project. However, with these changes, the very good news is that we do have a path forward that does meet many of the initial objectives and goals of the downtown development. In fact, with some of the changes we'll talk about, this is going to end up being one of the biggest, if not the biggest, investment in affordable housing in terms of a large major development in the history of Lakewood. So that's a good thing, along with many other main focuses of this project. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Director Leininger, who we've prepared a presentation to kind of go over the changes and then go over the path forward.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council President, Council Vice President Keppel, members of council. And thank you for all of you joining us a little bit earlier than what we normally schedule meetings for, so that we could have ample time to talk. And for Council President Litton for joining us while you're out of town. So thank you. 1 second here. Let's postpone that for a little bit. So I do have some slides here that I'm going to walk everybody through, and it's really, these are just more to help organize the conversation that we're going to have here this evening. As the mayor mentioned, we do have some news regarding the downtown projects and some changes that we'll be dealing with moving forward. We also have a path forward, and that path forward is really what we want to focus on tonight. Representatives from Casto and North Point Realty are here in the room with us. There may come a point in time when some of the conversation leads us to some items that are best suited for executive session. I've asked Casto and North Point to tell us when they get to that comfort level that they need to move into executive session, but we'll try to have as much of a conversation out here in the open session as we can, and then go from there. So as the mayor mentioned, we do have some news to share as it relates to the downtown project. Specifically, Roundstone had recently advised us that they have selected a site outside of the city. They no longer are going to be part of the downtown project. There's a few reasons for that they shared with us. One, they advised both us and the developer that their priorities have changed. They were in the current arrangement, they were in a mixed-use building where they had shared ownership through a condominium association where they own floors 2, 3, and 4. Casto then and North Point Realty retained ownership of floor 1. And it was part of a mixed-use building. So those floors 2, 3, and 4, and a portion of floor 1 were dedicated to Roundstone and their office use. But really, the majority of that first floor was for commercial and retail uses for Casto and North Point to help activate the streetscape and activate the community space that we're kind of peeking into here on this photo. Through this time period, Roundstone simply decided that they would rather have sole ownership of the building, and they would like to be the sole occupant of the building. The other site offers that opportunity. They also shared a couple of other items related to the reason for their change in commitment. In part was related to the schedule that we're on compared to the schedule that they can be on in a different community. That schedule gets them in the ground in April of this year, with a delivery date of April of 24 or thereabouts for a building delivery. They also did share that there are some lower project costs associated with the other site. They also have options on adjacent property for future expansion and if their company should need it as they continue to grow. My computer like it's going to change. So as we learned about that news, of course, the Casto and the city, we continue to have our conversations with Roundstone to try to see what other options are available to the city to hopefully help keep them here in Lakewood. We talked about a couple different scenarios. Unfortunately, none of those could satisfy Roundstone, and they shared with us on multiple occasions unequivocally that their position was to move forward with another site. So that forced us into a pivot into what's the path forward for our project and for the city of Lakewood. Keep in mind, this project has always been more than just about Roundstone. This is a 6-acre mixed-use project that has housing, has affordable housing, has accessible housing, has new retail opportunities in the community, has a community space, more parking opportunities to help benefit downtown, benefit the Cleveland Clinic across the street. There's so much more to this project than just Roundstone, but Roundstone was an important part, and now we need to move forward about how do we replace that component piece. That requires a lot of things that we have not covered yet. We need to redesign Building A, which is what we're kind of looking into here right now. Reassess the parking garage because the parking demand changes considerably when you take 240 office users out of the garage. We need to rebuild the project pro forma, and we also need to re-engage with the school district. One of the things that council, as I shared in our last update, is the city and the school district were working very closely together to form a partnership around this project. We had reached an agreement on what that partnership looks like, and we're prepared to bring that to city council and to the school board when we learned of this news. And so we need to revisit with the school district about this, and they're aware of this news as well that we're sharing here today. So what does that path forward look like? As it relates to Building A, there's still a lot of things we don't know. Casto hasn't put pen to paper and won't put pen to paper until we really kind of coalesce around that path forward. They've had a significant investment in this site to this date, and Brent and others can speak to that. And there needs to be some commitment to them moving forward about the direction that we're headed. But in general, right now, Building A is a 4-story building. If you remember from our earlier conversations, we were talking about the term sheet, really kind of that max height we can get to before we change building types is to a 5-story building. So Building A would increase from a 4-story to a 5-story building. Retain the mixed-use design, so instead of office, and over the top, we would be looking at floors 2 through 5 becoming residential. And I'm going to jump around in the bullets here, but by adding that, there's 80 to 90 units. Again, we don't know exactly what that number is. There needs to be a lot of work done on Casto's side to get to that. But additional 80 to 90 units to the project, and also gives us opportunities for the additional unit mix as far as 1-bedrooms to potentially up to 3-bedroom units that are being considered. So on the first floor, we still retain that commercial space. Potentially that commercial space could expand on the first floor because of the fact that the office lobby did occupy a portion of that. May also be some need for amenities to support the residential units, but there could be an opportunity to increase the retail and commercial footprint as a result of this change. As we think about this change, I'm sorry, I moved John over to the other side. As you think about the impact of the change, all of our goals that we set out, the development objectives, the council priorities, those are still achievable, albeit without an office user. Maintains the mixed use of the building. We do have more vertical design. We have more density. And I apologize that 50% actually a typo. That should be 35% increase ballpark based on where we are today. Because there's more density in the project, we also have more affordable housing that's going to be provided. As the mayor noted, it's going to be the largest in decades, perhaps ever in the community. We're going to have more accessible housing. We have not had accessible housing built in this community on scale in many decades. The residential use, and I think this is important from a planner standpoint and someone who thinks about cities and how do we activate cities, the residential use does have the benefit of activating that community space, the core of the project in our downtown, 24/7, 365 days a year. If we think about it as an office building, floors 2, 3, and 4, we're going to be vacant, generally vacant, after 5 o'clock Monday through Friday and on most weekends. By having residential into that building, we're going to have an opportunity now to have people there 24/7, particularly on nights and weekends when that's when Lakewood comes alive because we are a bedroom community. We're going to put more people on the street, in our restaurants, in our shops, and in the spaces that this project will offer. The other benefit with this, and we can talk about this a little bit, I have some slides that will speak to the reduced financial gap. Again, we don't know exactly what that is, where we are in analyzing this change. There's a lot of work that has to be done to understand the financial gap. But as a general understanding of going from office to residential, and an office user that had a significant incentive request because there was 240 parking spaces that were essentially free into a garage that was going to cost $14 million, there is a reduction in the financial gap in the project. Again, TBD on what that amount is, but there should be a reduction. It's not going to eliminate all incentives by any means, but there will be reduced incentive. There's also going to be, because we think the site is nearby for where Roundstone's going, a lot of their employees do live in the community. Most likely they'll continue to live in the community, so the city will continue to receive the 1% income tax that's due to the city by being a resident. So those residents will continue to pay income tax. And what I'd sent out before the meeting as we were analyzing this is the direct cost and revenue impact to the city is generally neutral based on some parameters that we've established, knowing that there's a lot of information that we still need to gather. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through all these slides. What's important here is there's two slides of trying to determine what's the income tax that the residential is going to generate in two different scenarios. This one is with the office component. And these tables basically go through and look at the unit count, try to understand using HUD data what the incomes would be based on the number of people in the households, based on how we look at the units because of the incentives that were involved from 80%, 120%, and then the market in this case, we're using 150% of the median income. What does that translate then into as far as income in each unit? And then more importantly then, what is that in terms of income, what does that generate in terms of a payroll and an income tax to the city? So in this case, when there was an office user on the site, there was 233 residential units. We anticipate there would be about $265,000 in income tax generated to the city annually upon full build-out. And that's just a linear projection. That doesn't include any cost increase or any inflation or anything. It's just full build-out, today's numbers. That's what we would expect to see. This is that same analysis. I need to pick a longer time. That same analysis now without the office component. Again, looking at all the same parameters, but now instead of 233 units, 314 units. Any similar mix of units. Again, we don't exactly know what the unit mix is going to be, but just taking the same proportion of units that were in the previous example and extending it out to this one, we would generate almost $358,000 in income tax as a result of having more residential on the property versus the office. Now, it doesn't, of course, include the office, so that's what this table does. So here, generally what we're looking at are the city property taxes on an annual basis, the city income taxes, looking at the rows here, on an annual basis. We got to account for the incentives that are going into the project, and these are cash incentives that are going into the project, not TIFs and tax abatements that are talking about opportunity costs. These are actual costs to the city. And then what does that mean? In the columns then, we have what the office looks like in the middle. The outside middle is the no office example, the change that we're going to, and then what the difference is. So for property taxes, because there's a tax abatement, because there's going to be a TIF involved, the city doesn't receive anything for those first four use categories that are on the table. The townhomes are not subject to any incentive, and so we would receive property taxes from the townhomes. When we look at the income taxes, again, office versus non-office, the multifamily, the 265 number that we shared versus the 357 that was on the previous slide, so it's an additional $92,000. The office user was expected to generate at least about a $17.5 million payroll. That's a total of $262,500 a year. Of course, that's not there in the no office scenario. Commercial, we held equal. Townhomes, we held equal because there's no change in the townhomes. There may be some increase in the commercial, but until we know that, we're just assuming it's equal. So there is a net difference of $170,000 of going to the negative, going from an office and retail, or from an office and residential mix to a residential and retail mix. And we can't stop there because there are a significant amount of cash incentives that change substantially when we think about the office use versus the residential use. And so, again, in the office use, we were offering a $1.5 million job retention and creation incentive. If we annualize that over 30 years, so that's the incentive years, that's $50,000 per year. As we also shared previously, that there were 240 users in this garage that were associated with the office use that were not paying monthly rates. I believe they might have had a small maintenance fee associated with it, but they weren't paying a monthly rate. That created a substantial gap in the ability to finance and build that garage component. And so we were estimating at that point in time that was going to take almost $6 million of additional investment to make that garage a reality. And that garage has to be part of the project in order to make it work. It's really the linchpin of everything that's associated with this. And so the total cost of incentives per year with the office component was about $243,000. We aren't exactly, we know the job retention creation incentive goes away without the office user. We aren't exactly sure what's going to happen yet on the garage side. We think there's probably still going to be some type of gap, but we need to analyze that and be able to come back to you with a firmer number once, assuming council's okay with the direction that we're going and Roundstone puts pen to paper, we can dive into some of these details. But let's just assume that there has to still be $2 million made available for the public parking in the garage to make it viable financially. At that point, the difference is essentially negligible. It's a neutral in terms of a change going from office and residential component to a residential and retail component. And I think that's it's something that's important to consider. There was a lot of questions about this as internally as we talked about it, about what the economic impact was to the city. Yes, outside the incentives, it is a negative economic impact. However, with the amount of incentives that were involved, we end up in a neutral position over 30 years. And so that's, in a not so many words, where we are today. Again, Casto and North Point are here with you this evening to talk about where do we go from here. We're really focused in on this path forward. I'm happy to talk about the past, but the past is the past at this point, as I've shared. We think this is the best path forward for the project, the viable path forward for the project, and want to have a conversation with City Council here this evening. So that I'm happy to answer any questions, and then we can hand over to Castor. And Tracy Nichols is also joining us on the call this evening, so if you have any questions with her, she's available as well.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Leininger. Before we go on, I have been nudged by the council clerk to remind me to read that we are actually having a hybrid meeting this evening pursuant to Lakewood Codified Ordinance 109.01B1. As the presiding officer of council, I'm calling for council's meeting this evening, February 6, 2023, to be held by video conference due to the special circumstance of President Litton's travel, and Councilman Litton need not be present for the purpose of voting and determining a quorum. So that is read in, and with that, President Litton, I see you there. Did you want to make any remarks before we move forward?
Thank you, Vice President Keppel. I appreciate not only the update from the administration, but to my colleagues, the fact that we're meeting this early, the fact that we are meeting on an evening I can't be there for the main council meeting, thus creating a gap in between, and all those sorts of inconveniences. Just know how much I appreciate your ability to make this meeting happen on such an important topic for the city of Lakewood. I just want to make sure that anything that can and ought to be shared publicly at this time regarding our downtown redevelopment be shared in this portion of our committee meeting, and thus, if it's the chair's opinion, allow the administration to share anything else that they think we ought to know regarding these most recent developments that ought to be shared in a public setting.
I don't have anything else to share. I'll look back to Brent. I don't think there's anything else from Casto and North Point's standpoint to share, unless there's any questions of what the information I just shared with you.
Colleagues, any questions on what we have seen thus far that are appropriate for a public setting?
Madam Vice President, or Madam Chair, I guess, in this context.
Sure.
I have some questions, but I'd love to hear from the development team. You know, as part of the presentation, because they may have answers to the questions that I would like to ask.
Okay. Do you want to do those in the open session, or are there more detailed financial questions?
Well, maybe a round of open session, and then we can reserve any confidential financial and real estate transaction related questions for a potential executive session if we come to that. Thanks.
Okay. Question? Well, did you want to go ahead and ask those? Okay. I think that's what we're doing right now. I don't believe, there's not another presentation, is there, Director Leininger?
No, there's not another presentation, and there was nothing else to add to what we shared.
So if you have questions about what was shared that are appropriate for a public setting, now would be.
Thank you. Yeah, I do, Madam Chair. Thanks. Okay, I don't want to jump in front of anybody else. So first of all, to Casto and North Point both, I want to thank you for your strong stomach. Apparently, the development business probably rivals Cedar Fair, you know, roller coaster design engineers for the need for that, because there are a bunch of changes. I recall talking to another developer at one point that community, when you have a publicly owned project site and a community is engaged as Lakewood, it's a little bit like doing creative writing by a committee of 100, you know, and that's difficult. Even if you're just talking about the architecture here, of course, we're talking about the financials, the operations, and the architecture, and plenty of other features. So I want to open by thanking you for your stick-to-itiveness, to quote a former NFL announcer. A couple of small questions. One is, do we know how many accessible units are envisioned? Doesn't have to be an exact number, but are we talking about a handful or a majority of the units or somewhere in between?
I don't know off the top of my head. It'll be driven by fair housing requirements.
Okay.
And the standards that's required through that.
Okay. The reason I say that, I do think that's a very significant and meaningful feature of this project. And some of my colleagues, especially the one to my right, your left, is appropriately been focused on that along with Mayor George. So that's a very positive feature of what you're proposing. So so more is better. We appreciate that. Secondly, does the additional 80 to 90 units in this potential change help your business case financially? You know, so from a Casto and a North Point operations point of view, an office user not being part of the proposed plan means you're adding a lot of other use. Mm-hmm. Is it a wash financially? Is it favorable or unfavorable? Just curious from your perspective.
It's generally a wash.
Okay.
The garage will improve, as Sean alluded to, basically eliminating 240 non-paying spaces. But the total equity and the returns are generally about the same. But right now it's all conceptual because we do not have anything designed for Building A. It's just really previous 5-story buildings that we've built, kind of using those as an assumed cost and kind of backing into a high-level pro forma. So.
Okay. So just so I can understand, so from your perspective, you're an owner operator, perhaps with an operations agreement with North Point Realty as a partner, and the rents you command are going to be what pays off the financial investment. So as long as those are in the same range, you can work with either scenario. Is that right?
When you say either scenario,
Well, I'm asking as a kind of a layperson and a community representative, which viewed an office tenant as a major feature and positive for the project. We still have mixed use in what we contemplate, but not an office user. So from your perspective, it sounds to me, if I'm hearing you correctly, maybe educate us if not. You know, from Casa's perspective, does it matter if it's an office user or not an office user? You can work with anybody.
I think it becomes easier with one owner on site
Okay.
that controls everything. So I think the operation side gets a little easier. By having one less use, that gets a little easier too from the operations side. Financially, it's about the same, as I had mentioned, because we lost a Vibrant Communities grant that was tied to the office piece. And the way the TIF was working, that tax revenue was coming back in to fund the project. So when you take some of those out relative to the residential rents, we ended up pretty close to the same spot. I think Sean's point kind of around planning and the more vibrancy that residential brings is probably better overall for the site and for the commercial users, just providing more activity in the evening and weekend. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay, thanks. And then on the garage, I know it's early days, and we're always looking to pin down. So we anticipate closing a financial gap because we'll have fewer subsidized parking spaces, unsubsidized parking, saying that backwards. We'll have fewer spaces that need subsidy.
Correct.
Will we have the same total number
We-
overall?
We think the half level that we added when Roundstone required the 240 can come off.
Okay,
So you lose about 80 spaces, then you also have more paying customers. So in
And-
theory,
and-
that should,
so that should help the financials. From the public, let's say I'm a member of the community or just a customer coming to visit Lakewoods downtown, the interest they have in the parking garage is just the overall parking capacity for visitors. Visitors to this site, to your site, or I don't know if they're allowed to park here and walk somewhere else. That'll probably happen to a certain degree. But either which way, can we project at this stage the impact on that use case for parking in that proposed deck? Is it the same amount, less, more? We don't know.
it would be the same public amount
Okay.
as we had previously. So we're not adjusting any of the
Okay.
public spaces.
Okay.
How that works operationally, that's the detail we still have to get to in the future.
Okay, super. Last little comment from me. The public plaza, which is a favorite for me, certainly, theme. You know, the first, if we don't have an office user, my thought kind of became, well, does that, if I'm I'm not going to live on this site. I will shop, I hope, or enjoy the stores and visit, and maybe when there are public street festivals and other events in the community, I'll visit and enjoy. Will I feel as welcome without the office user there? That's, again, a layperson's question, and so I look to developers, designers, architects to help answer that. But what I'm driving at is that I think it's one of the signal features of this project for the community at large is that public plaza, even though it's actually a privately owned plaza, which we hope will invite the public in an inviting way. And so if it's an all residential interior court, that's kind of has a different feel. Now, we do envision retail businesses all around there, so it's not an all residential court. But does that thought from a layperson's perspective have any validity of concern? Like, do we need to be extra careful now because we won't have office users there who will be using that public plaza as kind of their front porch any longer, does that mean it's any less public in character or tone?
I think that's a personal preference when you're in the plaza, but my personal preference would be a residential building is more inviting and welcoming than an office building. And I think by having more people living there, that's going to be more activated, and they would use that more as a front porch than the office tenant.
Okay, so we can make it work this way too, is the, okay, thank you. That answers my questions. Appreciate it.
Councilman Rader.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the development team and the administration for pulling this together. A lot of things aren't in our control, but some of the things are, and some of the things that are, I think, are coming along the right direction. I mean, just to answer your question, based on some of the numbers the administration provided, just kind of guesstimations and using that 10%, figuring you did for the low to moderate income, looking at a plus 18, is that about right? On 9 on the 80%, plus 9 on the 120%. So that's potentially the opportunity for 18 more families, 18 more individuals to be living in our community that are at sort of get an advantage and aren't going to be at that market rate, are going to be able to rent here below market, which is, I think, a good thing. If I'm in the school district shoes, I'm not, but maybe this is something we could talk to the schools about. Having more families, I think, is an advantage over, I don't know what exactly a business would do in terms of tax revenue for the schools, but having families and people here potentially having kids in the district is a positive. This is my neighborhood, right? I live right across the street from the Center North building, and I stop in there occasionally, go to Forage all the time, meet people, and I stop in and talk to the folks there. And they've been at 95% occupancy for as long as I've ever chatted with the folks there. In fact, was just there last week, 95% occupancy. So I know in my neighborhood there's a need for housing. So I think this is actually not a bad direction. What was the last thing? Oh, I was going to say on Mr. Bullock's points, I think the public space is something that we need to continue to talk about. I think making sure that it's open to my community, my whole neighborhood, just not this one development block, that it is certainly welcoming. I'm sure there's ways we can do it. I know we spent a lot of time talking about how that office building was scaled up to kind of open that space up. I'm hoping that those kind of conversations can continue, because I'm sure this building's going to change as we move forward, and I want to make sure that we do. In fact, I'm still honestly preferential, even though I know all the research and all the planning wonks will disagree, that the corner lot being open to the public kind of makes more sense from my perspective. I may be biased because that's my corner, right? I can walk down the street, I'd be able to see this beautiful public space. So I take that with a grain of salt, I suppose. So that's all I have at this point. Look forward to whatever conversations come next. And certainly I do have some questions about the financial bits and pieces, but we can take those at council leadership's discretion.
Councilwoman Marks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. How many total parking spaces will there be with this change?
What were we at last?
540.
540.
So minus
in the garage, so I
460.
think we get down to about 460 in the garage, and I think there's another 20 surface spaces on site, and depends how you want to count on street.
So there will be parking available for these additional
Correct.
units? So they will have parking available?
Yeah.
And will there be parking available for public also in the parking
Yes.
garage?
Yes.
Do you know how many spaces for public?
We have 75 allocated for the clinic, so those become available to the public after 6 and on the weekend. And I do not have the matrix that we've been using at Planning Commission. I don't know if you have that up, but what we've shown from a public standpoint will be maintained going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Baker.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the administration. I can appreciate that putting those slides together was a lot of work, so appreciate the planning department and administration for doing that. Digging in a little bit into the numbers, I'm curious as to the 5 million versus the 2 million on the parking garage. And you explained it a little bit, but, and I see kind of like the reasoning behind valuing it and, putting it as part of the analysis, but I was just curious as how you arrived at those numbers.
So the 2 million is completely just a placeholder right now because we don't have the analysis on the new garage and what the costs are going to be with it, what then the ratepayers will be that go into it, and that overall just operational component that Mr. Sobczak alluded to earlier, that is really kind of the magic of how we drive what's open to the public versus what's reserved for residents and employees. In terms of the 5.8 million, and Tracy's on the call with us as well, and Tracy, correct me if I'm wrong, so we know the garage had a construction valuation of about $14 million. We knew that the TIF was going to be 100% TIF as we were having conversations with the schools, and that would generate X number of dollars. And I don't have those exact figures with me as right now. We knew the ratepayers were going to generate so much revenue to the site. We knew how much there was going to be borrowing limits on a garage and what those borrowing limits were going to be. When you factor all those revenue sources in to get to determine can we afford a $14 million garage, there was still almost a $6 million gap, a 5.8, whatever that number is up there, $5.8 million gap that could only be closed with additional cash into the garage. So that's how we arrived at it. There weren't enough ratepayers. And therefore there wasn't enough revenue. There were limitations on how much debt could be borrowed against the asset. And then the TIF is only going to generate so much money, and it just wasn't enough to pay for it.
So the sense I get then is the 5.8 number is as educated as a number as we can get today. But
that was a fairly real number.
Yeah, but the 2 is the one that's a little bit.
That one's squishy.
It's a swag. Yeah. Okay. Because I think that's, and these numbers are extremely helpful, and they provide, at least this is how my mind thinks. So, to the extent, I just want to let you know that I appreciate it. The one thing that I, think about, and this is where, the 2017 study is now 6 years ago or 7 years ago, so it's, not great. But, I do think that having an office component, it is a little different than residential, just in the sense of, police and fire resources, city resources in general, offices require a little bit less. So there is a little bit of a push-pull with, obviously the vibrancy that Casto is going for is increased exponentially with residential units. Some of the, I think, burden on city services may be a little higher, but that's just part of the analysis. And what I'm curious about is, obviously, Roundstone is a big employer in the city now. Sounds like they've pretty affirmatively made their decision about what they're doing. I'm just curious as to if there were any other attempts at office users and, just to kind of explain it on the public record, what we may have done to show, because I think it looks like we have a lot of retail component here, obviously have a lot of housing component here. I even think the 2017 study, from a residential perspective, I think the numbers are probably still good, and it said like 340 units is what the market could absorb here. So we're getting closer to that number. That's good. But the office component, where obviously it's sinking closer to zero. So I'm just curious if the administration could talk a little bit about that process, and maybe even North Point has some analysis on that point too.
So from our perspective, we do not have a bench for office users looking for space in the community, and that's consistent with what we see around the region, well, not just around the region, around the entire country with what's happening with office users right now. Just in the last 2 weeks, there's probably been 4 or 5 articles about major office buildings around, whether it's Rocky River, downtown, around the region that have been converting over into residential spaces because there's no demand on the office side. We actually have that same situation. The Lakewood Center West building is currently for sale. The active potential buyer that's looking at doing a residential conversion of that building. And so there simply isn't a market for office, especially Class A office. Throughout this process, when we've had 1, maybe 2 that have come to us looking for some space, and we've working on space throughout the entire city. We also had conversations about this space, but they're not looking for Class A space. They want They want to be in that $20 a square foot space, not $35 a square foot plus where we'll be in this space. So it worked great with Roundstone because they wanted to own their building. So that's really easy. Now we have somebody who's going to come in, pay for their cost and be there. But there just isn't a bench right now, and we don't foresee one coming. Tracy's involved in these deals around now in multiple states, given her relocation, so she can probably add more to it, and I see Bart's to the podium, so that's where we are.
Yeah, Sean, I'll just add that we have a lot of Class A space where in downtown where there were firms that are giving up floors. And so we're seeing that Class A space availability is now where there was none, there's now availability. So I would just say that there were no office buildings that my firm is working on at this time, and especially not spec. So that would be my opinion as well, is that there's not really a market at this time for office.
And Tracy, could you please explain what spec means, just for the public as well?
Spec means to build an office building or any building without an end user. And in this case, before, Casta was willing to build the building because he had an end user. And so that was the reason that they would undertake an office building in this economy. At this point, there is not an end user, and therefore it would be a speculative project, very hard to finance and very risky in this market.
Mr. Baker, I was going to go to him next, but I didn't know if you had specific questions, so go ahead, Mr. Simon.
Well, Sean and Tracy really answered it. Roundstone was an anomaly. I hadn't seen that before, really, in my 50 years of development of office buildings. There were pluses and minuses to it, but it was great on the plus side to have a building filled, at least on the upper floors. Office is, in the words of a well-known broker in town, is dead throughout the country, but here. The vacancy factors have increased dramatically this year, 20%. There are no users that we know of that are in the market, and if they are, they're looking at $18, $19 fully gross leases. The landlord pays for everything. And if you take $9 or $10 of gross expenses out of $18, you have $8 to service a debt, which, by the way, you couldn't get. There's no lender that would loan money today on a speculative office building. And even if there was a prospective tenant, it would have to be a very long-term lease, 20 years, with bumps every 5 years in the rent. And again, that's a challenge. So there's sort of a welcoming of this new concept of converting to residential. We almost bifurcated the site. It was a user that wasn't really part of the ownership. We knew who they were, but they weren't integrated into the entirety of this concept. Now there will be a single landlord that has a great interest in making it successful and has all the resources and dynamics to bring it about, assuming one very important fact, if I may, that there is a light at the end of the approval tunnel. Is there an end date that one could say, on this particular date, assuming you have fulfilled the normal requirements that any city would require, will you get approval? I'm not sure there is in the city of Lakewood. I've always felt it's like a circular tunnel. I feel like almost like a gerbil. You go to meetings, and the greatest people. We love the city. It's a wonderful community. We've been in this community for 30 years. We own the building across the street. But if there was some possibility that there could be a process that literally stipulates if you reach this hurdle and you succeed, you will get approval to begin construction. I don't think we're that far along, even though it's been over 2 years. And again, this is not criticism, because we view ourselves as your partner. I mean, we're putting in $100 million, but we are partners together, because it's your community. You live here. So we're trying to join forces together to say, yes, this is a process that you can rely upon and that you can finalize your construction costs. Can't do it over 2 years. We've seen what's happened to interest rates, material costs. It's, the world has changed, and most specifically for projects like this. But one thing is guaranteed: if this happens, it's going to be transformational. It will be an unbelievable project, probably the best I've seen. And I've seen and been involved in some of these in the Cleveland area, Van Aken, Pinecrest. This is going to be special. So that's more of an answer than you wanted, and I apologize, but I'm old and I don't know when to stop.
Thank you, Mr. Simon.
Chair, and I'm curious if you could kind of go through, give us a bullet point of like what you see as some of the things that us as a council could be doing better to help those issues you just discussed. You know, from a perspective of delays or whatever you were speaking about with the process and meetings. And is there anything that council could be doing better to help make this better for you or future projects?
That's probably something we could put together collectively with Sean and provide to you guys later. I think from just a short answer, the volume of meetings without real direction or clarity on what is desired is a big issue. We're in communities all across Ohio. We're used to dealing with architecture. We're used to changing bricks and roof lines and architectural detail, but it's always given with a direction and a goal of where the Architectural Review Board and Planning Commissions want to take the look of the project to fit within whatever district or area that they're trying to work within. Our feedback often is, we don't like it, but we're not here to tell you what we want to do. So we're left guessing and guessing. That's a tough position to be in from our standpoint.
And Ms., is that a little bit the PUD process? I mean, you know, do you think mixed use would have been better? This is a little in the weeds. I'm just curious because PUD kind of creates this weird zoning classification that.
It's part of it, but it's also like the direction, clarity. Like, this is what we're looking for. You're not quite there. You need to work harder on this building or this facade or this detail.
Madam Chair.
And
Yeah,
Sean, I don't.
I think we're getting a little away from the purpose of this meeting. So I think this is an important conversation to be had, but I think for the purpose of this meeting, we want to be looking at moving forward with the project as we're facing it now. But I do think we should circle back to that conversation. But at the moment, I'd like to refocus us on discussing moving forward with Building A's new future. And to that point, I had a couple questions, which are going to seem pretty minute after talking about those big picture issues, but I just wanted to ask about, with the changes to the garage, I know there was a lot of discussion about liner units. Is there an opportunity to reframe that garage so that that takes that out of play? Or are we not really looking at?
Takes the liner units out of play?
Yes. And it's okay if we're not ready to have that conversation. I just wondered. I was just thinking about that with, because it was such a big discussion.
Well, I think ARB wants them.
Right.
The Planning Commission doesn't.
Right. To that point, but if we're taking away spaces, I just wondered if there was, or if we're not talking about it.
It'll only remove the top layer.
I see.
It's not going to shrink the footprint. So I would say no at this point.
Okay. And then my other question in terms of with Building A, you mentioned about some redesign, obviously, since it has a different purpose now. What kind of time frame would there be on that, do you think, before that redesign would be?
I think that would be a good question to ask in the next session.
Okay. Speaking of which, before we move on, I did want to give Councilman Schagner, okay. I do want to make sure we get to President Litton, too, who also has a couple questions and hasn't had a chance to do that yet. So Councilman Schagner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Leininger, I'm just curious on the previous points, because this does have to do with the project going forward and the ability for it. So where's the logjam now, and what type of direction in the pre-planning meetings is the planning department giving to the boards prior to hearing from the Casto or North Point?
So we don't provide any direction outside of the public meeting. Our direction is at the public meeting. I think some of the frustration from the applicant side and from the staff side, and I spoke about this in our budget conversation when I proposed that we need to rewrite our zoning code, is the fact that we have these broad brush standards that they say some very broad utopian planning provision that they'd like to see incorporated in the site, but doesn't tell you how to do or what does that mean, versus other communities that I suspect Mr. Sobchak is referring to, and others that I'm familiar with, where you have a more specific set of standards that say, look, in this type of building, in this type of setting, here's what we're looking for. We're looking for these types of features on the storefront. We're looking for these types of transitions and how the building goes vertically. These are the types of materials that we allow. There's flexibility and creativity that's allowed within that, but there's a basic game plan about how we're going to engage and have conversations with the developer. And then when you come to those meetings, then it's about just refining that and making it work with the surrounding community. So that's really where a lot of the frustration, I think, is on everybody's part. And we've seen on several times where we don't like this, so just come back and we'll tell you when we like it. And that's not just to this applicant. This has happened to other applicants. And part of that is, in the root of it, is the code. And so the code has to get better. The design standards have to get better. We actually don't have design standards for residential. I think I've shared that with you before. So that's another point of frustration, but we regulate residential design. So
there's a combination of multiple veto points with unclear standards, right?
yeah.
Okay.
There's also no timeline in the code. So generally what happens is that once an applicant makes a submission, there's so many days, staff has so many days to determine if that submission's complete. Usually that's 10 business days. Once you make that determination, now everybody's on the clock. So Planning Commission, ABR, BZA, you have 60 days, 75 days, whatever it might be. You have that many days to make a decision because you now have a complete application. That application may meet code and it should be approved. It may be close to meeting code, it can be approved with conditions, or it may just be outright not approvable and it maybe needs to be denied, or you work with the applicant and we agree to give more time. So that's on the other side of the equation. There's not a prescribed timeline in our code like many other communities have within it.
There's no point, like with our code currently, where the developer could say, this is our final plan, what are you going to do with it? They could just say, hey, come back to us later with this, and this change. There's no, it's just at what point the developer wants to walk away from it.
Well,
It's a
there's
standard.
always a point where the developer could do that, and probably should do that, and that's something we have to have a conversation moving forward, about how do we advance this, and, because this is both an art and a science. We want to work together to develop a solution that everybody's comfortable with and happy with, but there comes a point in time when we have to make a decision.
And how aware is the Planning Commission and the Architectural Board of Review of those, of that dynamic and necessity?
So Planning Commission, probably not much, because they only saw this application twice. ABR, we've continued to have some conversations with them. I think they're aware of the concerns, and we just have to figure out how to work moving forward.
All right, thank you.
Yep, thanks. I think I promised Councilman Bullock that I'd go back to him, and I'm going to do that. I just want to be cognizant of our time. We have about an hour. Councilman Litton does have another meeting to get to. We have some other things to discuss, and for the general tone of this conversation, we don't want to be holding things up any more than we need to be doing, so I want to make sure we get into our next part of the conversation. I do want to discuss further in the future this conversation about the process, and certainly be respectful of the volunteers serving on those boards and commissions and their service. So we'll continue that conversation, but I want to make sure we get a chance to hear from all of our experts who are giving us their time this evening here. So Councilman Bullock.
Thanks. I can be fast and talk like a New Yorker, so I'm even faster. Just a comment I forgot to mention before. I got a good piece of feedback from some informed, community members. The ideal housing unit type would be 2-3 bedroom type units, because ideally we would be having more families with school-age kids for a bunch of different reasons. Frankly, the home run would be affordable units, 2 and 3 bedroom, because then we'd have a way to keep, maintain socioeconomic diversity in our community, which needs to continue to be present in our schools. That's a bigger trend than this project, but I did want to share that feedback. I thought it was good. We're getting really important new, I hate the term housing product, but I'm picking it up from coming to meetings like this. So housing product that we don't have as much of a supply of in this city, so this is all great to add this. And also to the degree that we can have affordable 2 and 3 family, that's a special need. As far as the end date, we'll get it done. I think the way through is communicate, and over-communicate some more. There's a way to get it done. And appreciate the, hanging in there. We're going to get through it. And I think that if there's been some delay, all of us can pull together and see it through, regardless of the process on the paper. I would be curious to Mr. Bart Simon, the transformational nature that you described. In some ways, this is kind of a naive question, but when you say that this is the biggest project or the most transformational project, can you unpack for us the top 2 or 3 features that you have in mind when you say that?
Maybe it was a personal opinion.
Oh, that's great. I welcome it, yeah.
Obviously, we wouldn't be doing this if we didn't feel within ourselves that this was going to be a triple A+ development. Ever since I saw the original drawings prepared, and I've sort of been in the background a little bit, I just thought they were beautiful. I mean, I've been a real estate developer for 52 years, and I've been involved in over 50 projects. I just thought this was an award winner. I'm from the East Side. I was born in Shaker Heights. I grew up there. I rode my bicycle to Van Aken Shopping Center every day, and they've done a wonderful job, the Ratner family, in developing that. And I would never be critical of it, but there are components to that I don't see here that I think are a plus for us, and that is it's disparate. There's something over here, there's something over there. Again, it's very successful, so I'm not in any way being negative, but ours is cohesive. It brings people together. Once you step off of Detroit and you are home, and we envelop you. In Pinecrest, I know the developers very well, and again, I'm not being critical, but the buildings are dark. The circulation around that site is interesting, to say the least. The topography from the cinema at the top to the street, it looks like it's 20 feet. Here, you walk off a curb onto a beautiful plaza, and with shops and restaurants around you. And it's also a small, intimate site, 5.6 acres. It has everything going for itself, in my opinion. And we'd be putting in a lot of equity that has taken a lot of years to create. So I don't do it without a lot of forethought. But I think this would be great, and we're all in.
Great.
As long as we get an approval process that gives us a date certain that we can go.
Great. It is helpful, I think, this is your business, your profession, your expertise is informative. So we appreciate what you said, and it's on us. Okay, you've volleyed the tennis ball over the net. We hear you clearly. We got to field it and give you some kind of clarity soon on dates. So I personally am happy to work with you.
Happy
Thanks.
to do it.
Thank you. Okay. So I wanted to first say thank you, everyone, for your candid honesty and feedback. I did want to refer folks once again. I'll make a plea to in the vein of looking for guidance that we do have the council priority document that could help inform our conversation that we're probably going to have shortly. I believe Director Leininger, you had a thought, and then I'm going to go to President Litton.
Yeah, Madam Chair, you had stated this, but we were talking about our process for a second there, and I want to reinforce something you said, the comments we're making about our process are rooted in the code. We certainly appreciate and respect that our volunteers that serve on our boards and commissions, they're only utilizing the tools that we give them, and we need to make the tools better. So I want to make sure it's clear that this is about our code and our process, not about the great expertise that we get from the tremendous talent that we have in our community. So their experience doesn't go without note, and what we're talking about is about our process and code.
Great, good thought. Now, finally, President Litton.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Vice President Keppel. I'm going to withhold any further questions. I think my colleagues have all asked some really, really good questions in a public forum here tonight. I think that there are some, financial or real estate questions that we ought to probably discuss in executive session in order to be able to proceed forward with things. And so with that, I'd like to move that we move Committee of the Whole into executive session for the purpose of discussing real estate transactions and other things. And that we include, of course, all of council, our council staff, members of the administration who are present there, as well as any development-related individuals who are present. With that said, and this is a long-winded motion, I apologize. I'd like for council to have a few minutes to itself first to discuss things, and then allow those other people that were invited to join us in the room if that motion suits the law department.
Yes. All right, so I will second that motion that Assistant Director Swallow has indicated suits her.
we do a roll call?
I'm the chair.
Baker,
Yes.
Bullock,
Yes.
Keppel.
Yes.
Litton,
Yes.
Marks, Rader.
Yes.
Shackner.
That motion passes, so we're going to head into executive
Actually,
session.
if we could remain in here,
We're
and
gonna-
I will take care of the doors. We have a big group of people that showed up for some police officer swearing-ins. And so I have them in this conference room.
Okay.
If you noticed, I was running around a little bit. So I'll just ask this group to join them, and then we'll close the doors and stay in here.
Okay.
Does that,
Yes, in terms of recording and broadcasting,
There's a separate Zoom setup, I know that.
you can't stop the recording? Okay. All right, hang on.
So we'll
Yeah.
We'll
Or do you
swap them
want to
into
just have
here.
John have them come?
And Tracy and Council President Linton, you had a separate link for the executive session, so that should be live. If you guys move over to that, we'll be able to go from there. And we'll keep this, we'll keep this one live, so if you need to hop back in here, we can hop back in here.
Council members, please take your place on the dais. We need to adjourn committee of the whole.
Yeah.
All right, so we are still in committee of the whole, move to adjourn, exit executive session. Thank you.
Second. Second.
Thank you. Madam Clerk?
Baker.
Yes.
Bullock.
Yes.
Keppel.
Yes.
Litton, absent. Marks. Rader.
Yes.
Shackner.
And that motion passes. No further business before committee of the whole. Committee of the whole is adjourned. We're going to take maybe 2 minutes, and then we will start the full meeting of council. So 2 minutes. We'll be right back.